Hi folks, we're Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the propaganda, the globalist propaganda, as usual, grotesque misrepresentations of reality and endless lies and so on, where they're trying to show or prove or demonstrate, quite falsely, that there was never any such thing as an all-white country, that every country in the West, the advanced West, the technological West, was always about equal numbers of black and white, and if not slightly more black people than white, and that all the major advances in technology, and even going back to thousands of years ago, were all done by black people. And white people really kind of didn't have too much to do with it. Now, all major history and technological history is being rewritten. If there was a major medical advancement, then it wasn't the scientist, the straight white male scientist that we always thought did the gig. It was actually his black lesbian house cleaner or cook that made the discovery, the scientific, even though that she was an illiterate third world, but it didn't matter. She was the genius, straight white male that we've always thought, whether it be Louis Pasteur or Gustave Eiffel or Stevenson or Alexander Graham Bell or Tesla, all of them actually it was their black lesbian companion that did it. So I don't know how many people believe this nonsense, but the nonsense isn't being pushed back on. There's very little pushback in the mainstream. If any pushback in the mainstream on this insane nonsense, and it's being aggressively taught in schools all over the Western world now, including the famous Stonehenge in Britain was really built by black people, and 10,000 years ago there were black people in Roman Britain. There are blacks everywhere, and this sort of thing, which of course is arrant nonsense, but that isn't stopping them spreading the lies. Now, if we look at, say, photographs and videos from England, Britain generally, up until probably the early 1980s, you'd struggle in any school photograph, particularly if in the downtown sort of Brixton areas of London, that sort of thing. You would see what today we would call multicultural, but back in the day, 99% of the schools in England would have been, you can see this from the school photographs, they were all white. Now you do see a change. For example, in the thumbnail, I think it's a 1960s London school. There, look, it's all women or young women, so I suppose it's a girls' school. But if you look at any of these photos that are in the public domain, you won't see anyone that isn't white and white English, British. So the idea that there were lots of black people around or non-white people around is simply absurd. And the further away you go from London, the less likely it is that you'd see any non-white people. And as I've mentioned in other videos, I think it was in the town of Paynton in Devon, which is County Devon, which is in south West England, and Paynton's a town of, I don't know, 10,000 people, whatever it was. And they hired a cafe there, a restaurant, hired a black guy from somewhere or other, just over the summer, I suppose August or some July, August, somewhere around there, just over the summertime, to work at their cafe. And it was a huge novelty. There was people were coming from miles around because they'd never seen or spoken to a black person before, and it was front page news in the local media, and everyone was losing their minds over it. Such was the shock, and such was the novelty. So you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people that in that wider area who had never seen a black person before. So clearly there were not a lot of black people, and if you look at the stats, then you can get somewhere between 0.8 and I think 1.1% of the population, even in the late 60s, were considered non-white, which included Asians, Chinese and Indians and black people, and a lot of the black people were also, quarter black, eighth black, that sort of thing. So they would have looked swarthy rather than black. So, but nonetheless, the propaganda is insisting that black people have always been in Britain in large numbers and have always been prominent in every field of endeavour, whether it's scientific or and there's the favourite thing now is to say that any black person, any black hood that gets in a shootout with police in downtown, well, he was studying to be an architect. Yeah, architect is a good guy. I think it's because it's got 3 syllables and not everyone can pronounce it. Architect, that sounds silly. But just looking at this wider, that propaganda is everywhere. And now in Australia, it was a little bit different because there was a local Indigenous population, not large. There was, in the whole of Australia, there was fewer than 1 million Indigenous natives when the white folks fronted up. So, less than you'd see in a sort of medium-sized city, I guess, today. So they were broken up into little tiny tribes, sometimes of 50 people or less. They were at constant warfare with each other. They were very brutal. Even the first white people to arrive were shocked at how brutal the Aborigines were to each other. This comes from, again, a society by today's standards we would regard as brutal. So when we look at Australia, but I mean, just my own experience with this was the primary school that I went, the kindergarten type, the early. There was only white people in that. In the primary school I went to, that's before age 11 or 12, whatever it is, I was only white kids there. I never saw her. There was one girl who, for some reason I remember her name, Marilyn, I don't know why. It was alleged her, and it was spoken about in hushed tones, that her great-grandfather was black. He was like a Jamaican seaman or something like that. And that was sort of, she was considered to be, just a little bit different. I don't remember people treating her differently. I mean, I didn't treat her any differently, but that idea of that there was various vernacular that used to go around at the time, like she's had a touch of the tar brush, that type of thing. But she was slightly swarthy. I mean, you wouldn't actually know it. That it was in summertime. If she was, say, going to the beach, she would darken up more than anyone else. The rest of us would go red in the sun, and she would go brown. But I don't recall any different. But that was probably the only very remote and indirect experience I had with. I had a spell, mercifully not a long spell, in an area of Australia that was taking in a lot of migrants. Now, Australia was bringing, after World War II, Australia was in a state of sort of partial paranoia, where they had this view, populate or perish. That was the phrase going around. Now, their preference number one was people from Britain as migrants. Preference number two was Western Europe. People from, I don't know, Holland or France or Germany or Sweden, that sort of thing. And the last preference, but the biggest group of people that were available, was Greeks and Italians. Now, like if you look at, say, go to northern Italy, a lot of the people there are almost Germanic looking, for goodness sakes, and quite pale skinned. The further south you go in Italy, was where the swarthier people were, and it was in those areas where there'd been the most warfare and battles and disruption and this sort of thing during World War II. So there was a bigger cohort of them wanting to get out of Australia, get out of Italy, and the same thing with Greece. But then later on with Greece, there was a communist almost a civil war with the communists, and so there's quite a few Greek people. But most of the people coming out of southern Italy and southern Greece were illiterate. Not all, but most were illiterate peasants. And because they were in the refugee camps, then they were said, okay, we'll take some of them. So a lot of Greeks and Italians came in. And then later on, Maltese, and then from the Lebanese civil war and that sort of stuff, and all the disruption around that area, which took in parts of, say, Jordan and that so on. Then there was a big influx of Arabic people as well, Lebanon and all that. So, so anyway, for a brief time, I'd only known white. We lived in more affluent areas, I guess, but this the folks were getting a place, renovated and remodeled, and they wanted to save every penny, so we moved to an area that was where the rent was cheap, and while the house was being redone, which seemed to take forever, by the way. But so I went for the first time. Went to a school that had minority white, and the majority were the Lebanese, the Greeks, the Italians, the Maltese, and all that sort of stuff. And the largest white contingent was Irish. So anyway, that was the thing, and I was shocked at the behavioural difference. And I've mentioned this in other videos. The Arabs in particular behave very, very differently from the rest. Now, was there any prejudice that I recall, as in just hating or disliking somebody just because of the colour of their skin? Nothing else, just that. And I don't remember, even as a kid, I don't remember any prejudice, whether it be from the teachers or whether it be from other students at the school. This is a high school. I don't remember any of this. So I do remember behavioural differences causing an issue, and it sort of occurred to me at the time, which certainly a lesson I learned, which I was able to apply later on, was that racism, as it's viewed today, isn't about the colour of someone's skin. It's about the difference in their behaviour. And if people want to come to the West or come to a Western country from some third world basket case shithole, then they need to adopt the ways of the host country they've come to, assuming they want to start a new life and not just parasite off the host. But these Arabic kids, certainly by the ones I saw, and I'm sure there are exceptions, but they always seem to be engaging in some form of cruelty, which they enjoyed. They enjoyed inflicting, hurt, cruelty, and embarrassment on others. I couldn't, humiliation maybe more than embarrassment, and I couldn't understand that. And I've mentioned again in other videos, one of them would have no problem squatting in the middle of the sports change room, no trouble squatting and dropping a big turd in the middle of the floor, and then the Arab boys would then wait either side of the doorway as unsuspecting people came in, the kids came in, and they grab them and try and push them into and drag them through the turd that they've just dropped in the middle of the floor. And this was like not just an odd thing; it was a constant sort of. They were always doing that sort of stuff. They would, go into someone's school bag and find their lunch, their sandwiches that they'd brought for lunch, and they'd open those up and they'd start hacking. They'd always seem to have these strange respiratory problems. They'd start hacking, mucus and greenies and everything into the person's sandwich, and then put it all back and then put it back in their bag, and then they'd stand aside and watch the person eating the sandwich, and they'd all cheer and celebrate as if it was some huge accomplishment. But I don't recall, again, the racism just on someone's colour. Now, if you have if you got 100 brown Arabs and they all behave that way, then you would acquire a mindset that was suspicious of brown-skinned Arabs, because that's all you'd experience, people behaving that way. Would you call that prejudice or racism? I don't think I would, given the track record that these people have. but then at the end of that, and the school was always in uproar. The police were around every day. There were public canings that seemed to go on forever, and there were teachers and students having punch-ups, and it was insane. The school playground or recreational area at lunchtime was one where there were just seemed to be endless fights all over the place. There were one kid was They tried to hang him off the parallel bars, and he was carted off in an ambulance, and again the police around. It was that sort of place. And then went back to when the house was redone, went back to a middle class affluent area, or upper middle class affluent area, where there was no brown or black people. There wasn't any black people at the other school, but brown. Oh no, actually there was a couple of black people at the other place. Now, and suddenly everything calmed down. Everybody was well behaved. Everybody was, not every student was diligent, but there were very few that weren't. And there were different sorts of things, like the school with all the violence was very sporty. For example, remember the girls had 3 or 4 netball teams because they had so many good netball players, whereas the affluent school, they couldn't even get one team together. But there was also very different attitudes. If a teacher said at the violence school, well, we're going to call your parents or something like that, the kid would go, well, the fucking old man doesn't fucking speak English anyway. So that type of attitude. Whereas in the affluent school, all the had to be mentioned, do we have your father's work phone number? That was all that had to be. That was it. And then the whole classroom would descend into absolute silence. No one stepped out of line at that point. And the teacher was able to achieve total control of the class just by that line. Do we have your father's work phone number? as each kid sort of contemplated, the teacher, the school calling the parent. What, Billy Bob did what? Well, I'll attend to that straight away. So the idea of the good behaviour and solid citizenship and so on was very much a thing at the upper middle class school. Interestingly, it's also a place where the teachers had this strange radical leftism that if you're going to introduce woke policies and DEI type stuff and quotas and gender quotas, which was sort of just starting to begin when I was in high school at that time, then the best place to do it is with the well-behaved, well-mannered people. They're the ones. And the same way you see with the cops today across the Western world, the people they'll most heavily and brutally police are those who are most likely to be law-abiding. The ones who are least likely to be law-abiding are able to be subject to the softest, most lax policing. You've got to wonder why that is. So, but coming back to the idea of Australia was built by white people and white technology, and really it was and was already a well built up, well developed society, and it was only the people that came in who were brown skinned. This is after World War II. They were tightly confined to the working class areas, and in the area that was showed or demonstrated any sort of affluence was typically 100% white, and as evidenced by the high school I went to. So this idea of when I first started working, for example, or even going to college, but particularly working, seeing women in any sort of professional role was rare, and seeing anyone other than white people in prominent roles was equally rare. Now that's different. Now that was in a time, of course, of rigorous merit, strictly pass or fail. But as soon as standards were lowered and all this sort of thing, then the whole scene changed, and not for the better. But when they're trying to sell this idea, the globalists are trying to sell this idea. Well, black people have always been here, and you white people didn't really do anything. Like Louis Pasteur, really, was his black lesbian house cleaner that discovered that, and this sort of stuff. Then because of that aggressive rewriting of history and the eradication of the role of white people in creating the modern mercantile and technical world, then that aggressive displacement is going on, and to make that stick or get traction, they have to try and create this imaginary world where black people were very prominent and white people were just really incidental, if not irrelevant. I mean, this is insane because from the beginning of the mercantile age, and we can say from the early 1500s onwards, it was white technology and white mercantile organization, administration, and accounting and technology and so on that really dominated the world from that time. Even when China and India were the biggest economies in the world, only through the massive population, Western Europe still had a much higher per capita productivity from use of various things, such as windmills, water wheels, and so on. And so there's a much more and much higher productivity society than any of the Asian societies or African or anywhere else. So, but nonetheless, from the time of the mercantile age, when the Europeans developed the technology to sail around the world, and this is technology in both navigation and shipbuilding and sails and rigging and that sort of stuff. So the dominance of white people in world economic, mercantile, and industrial and technical affairs has been absolute really since the 1500s. Now you can look at some aberrations, the Ottoman Empire, for example. That you could look at that, but effectively the white people have been premier and or absolutely dominant for 500 plus years, and so to try and eradicate that by rewriting history is it's a stretch, and I think a fool's errand ultimately. You've been a Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.